Wow, you guys really sent us on a journey this time.
It's your journey.
Well, yeah, more like a deep dive, I guess.
Got it.
Yeah, a 4-hour exploration of the Narad Puran from the Shiv Official Podcast. That's a
commitment.
It really is. So, we're not asking you to block out your whole afternoon for this one.
Right.
But we did want to pull out some of the most insightful parts for you, the stuff that'll really get you thinking in new ways.
Exactly. And, Shiv and Prabha, the hosts of that podcast, they jump right into some pretty big ideas.
Yeah, like what?
Like devotion, the nature of consciousness healing.
Okay, big stuff.
Huge stuff. And they see it all through this lens of the Narad Puran.
Right.
It's kind of the framework for their whole discussion. And so what we're aiming to do here is distill that down to the essence, really try to highlight what's going to be the most interesting and useful for you on your path.
Awesome. Well, let's jump right in then with the figure at the center of it all.
Okay.
Narad Muni. Now, the podcast makes it very clear that he's so much more than just a name,
Oh, absolutely.
We're not just talking about some ancient figure in a text.
No. They present him as this archetype of a divine messenger, a symbol of higher cosmic intelligence. You can think of him as this constant bridge, this link between different dimensions, always connected to the flow of universal information.
Which I think is really interesting because it kind of shifts the common perception of him.
It does.
As this kind of troublemaker, a little bit of a mischievous figure.
Yeah. And the podcast tackles that head on. They clarify that, look, while his actions might seem disruptive sometimes,
right,
the deeper purpose is always about karmic resolution and spiritual transformation.
Okay.
It's everything he does is ultimately divine in the sense that it's pushing things towards growth, towards learning for individuals, and even for the whole cosmic system.
And the way they describe his communication is fascinating.
Yeah.
They talk about Akashic communication.
Yes.
So what exactly is that?
They describe it as this ability to tap into and transmit cosmic truths across all these different levels of reality. Almost like he's plugged into a universal field of knowledge.
Okay.
They even call him the eternal voice of divine consciousness.
Wow.
He's this fundamental part of how that intelligence expresses itself.
That makes me think about the logos, which they also mention.
Yes, absolutely. And so if we connect this to the bigger picture, right, the logos, this idea of the underlying order and reason of the cosmos.
Right.
So to present Narad as the embodiment of that, as this vibrational intelligence that's maintaining universal harmony, that makes his role even more profound. And then there's this fascinating detail they bring in.
Yeah.
His vina, his musical instrument. It's not just a source of beautiful melodies.
No.
It's a quantum transmitter of sacred frequency.
Okay, so what are the implications of that then?
Well, it takes him from just a messenger to something that's almost woven into the fabric of reality itself. It suggests that sound and vibration are these fundamental forces in the universe.
Fascinating. Okay, so let's shift our focus from Narad himself to the text that he's so closely associated with.
Okay.
The Narad Puran, now the podcast, really emphasizes the sheer scale of this text.
They do. It's massive.
Yeah, they point out it's one of the 18 Mahapuranas.
Right.
And it contains over 25,000 verses.
25,000, just imagine.
That's a lot of verses.
It really highlights how these Puranas are like encyclopedias.
Yeah.
They're trying to lay out a whole framework for understanding life, the universe, everything.
And the podcast highlights all these different topics that it covers, like the metaphysics of creation, subtle bodies, karma cycles, celestial realms.
Exactly, a whole cosmology.
The whole cosmology.
It really is. And, they even get into the specifics a little bit, like the 64 principles of creation.
Oh, wow.
And the interplay of Purusha and Prakriti.
That's pretty in-depth.
It is Purusha representing consciousness, Prakriti representing nature, and that dynamic between them is seen as the source of, all manifestation. They also talk about Mahatva, this great principle,
right,
often thought of as the first expression of nature from which the whole material world arises.
So these are like building blocks.
Yeah, building blocks of reality. And then there's the discussion of the 5 koshas.
Right, the 5 koshas, which I've encountered that idea before.
Yeah.
The different layers of the self.
Exactly, the layers of our being.
Yeah.
So you've got the Annamaya kosha, the physical body, the Pranamaya kosha, the energy body, the Manomaya kosha, the mental body.
Right.
Vijnanamaya kosha, the wisdom body, and the Anandamaya kosha, the bliss body.
Okay, so we're talking about the physical, the energetic, the mental.
All the way to the blissful. And what's interesting is how the podcast connects these koshas to this idea of devotional purification.
Okay, so it's not just about purifying the physical body.
No, it's about purifying all these different dimensions of our being.
So devotion, then, isn't just a religious practice.
Right.
It's a way to cleanse and refine all these different aspects of ourselves.
That's the core of their argument. They say very explicitly that the Narad Puran presents bhakti not as a practice, but as a psycho-spiritual energy. It's an energy that cleanses karmic impressions, they call them samskaras, that are embedded in the chitta, the subconscious mind.
Okay, so these samskaras are like deep-seated karmic impressions.
Yeah, like the roots.
And the chitta is like our subconscious.
Exactly. And they're saying that bhakti works on that level.
Wow.
It's not just surface level stuff. It's going to the root of our patterns.
Okay, so then bhakti is much more than just singing hymns or, performing rituals.
Right.
It's this powerful force that has the potential to really reshape us.
Yes. And they even call bhakti yoga a neuroscience of the soul.
That's a pretty intense comparison.
It is. But the idea is that through devotion, you're literally rewiring your neural pathways. You're activating the heart chakra, the anahata,
Okay.
and connecting to what they call divine frequency.
Okay, so we're thinking about the heart chakra not just as a physical location,
Yeah.
but as this energetic center.
Yes, a center of love, compassion, connection.
And they're suggesting that there's a real impact on our energetic systems.
Yeah, and maybe even our neurological systems.
And they outline 9 specific forms of bhakti.
9 forms.
Yeah, ranging from listening to stories to complete surrender.
Right. And what's fascinating here is that they present these forms not just as practices, but as stages of consciousness evolution.
Okay.
Each one leading to a deeper energetic awakening.
Just like a progressive path.
Yes, a path of intensifying our connection to the divine.
It's easy to see devotion as something passive or even weak sometimes.
Right, like it's a sign of weakness.
Yeah, but the podcast really challenges that.
They do. They say, look, devotion isn't emotional weakness at all. It's this powerful field of coherence that aligns the soul to source consciousness.
Wow.
And they even bring in this parallel to modern heart-brain coherence research.
Okay.
So it's like this ancient wisdom that's now being explored through science.
Wow, that's fascinating. And then to really illustrate these ideas, they bring in specific stories from the Narad Puran.
Yes, they do.
The first one is this amazing transformation of Valmiki.
Compelling story.
So Valmiki starts as a dacoit, right?
A bandit.
A bandit,
Mm-hmm.
and then undergoes this huge shift.
Yeah, and they point out that Narad Muni doesn't transform him through lectures or moralizing.
Right.
It's about awakening this dormant spiritual DNA.
And he does this through a mantra,
Yes, a mantramara.
which through repetition eventually becomes
Brahma.
beautiful.
Imagery of inner transformation.
It is, so the podcast interprets this as a reflection of neuroplasticity
Right.
through mantra repetition.
The brain rewiring itself based on experiences and
Yeah.
practices.
And they say that Valmiki's synaptic patterns were literally altered
Alter.
just through this sonic entrainment and shift in awareness.
The power of sound and attention.
Incredible. Okay, so the second story they share is about Prahlad
Yes.
and how he receives this divine wisdom while he's still in the womb.
That's what
Yeah, this is a remarkable story.
it is.
So the podcast presents this as a metaphor for epigenetic transmission.
Right. So the idea that high-frequency consciousness can actually alter even pre-birth memory.
So the mother's inner state, what she's exposed to, can really have a deep impact on the child even before they're born.
That's the implication they draw. They talk about Narad infusing bhakti into the prenatal field of Prahlad's mother,
Wow.
like shaping his destiny from the very beginning. And they connect this to the Vedic concept of garbha sanskar,
Okay.
practices and influences during pregnancy.
And then they tie that back to the scientific term fetal programming.
Ancient wisdom meeting modern science.
Yeah, exactly. And then the third story they focus on is Dhruva and his attainment of what they call pole-star consciousness.
Right. So Dhruva, this young boy facing rejection,
Mhm.
he turns inward and guided by Narad. He engages in this incredibly deep meditation.
And what's the key takeaway from that story?
The podcast emphasizes Dhruva's unwavering concentration,
Okay.
ekagrata, as the pivotal factor in his spiritual ascent. So they interpret his reaching that pole star consciousness as a symbolic journey from emotional pain to this astral elevation,
Okay.
a stable and super focused state of being achieved through that intense devotion.
So again, we see this theme of the power of inner focus.
Yeah.
And devotion to not only overcome challenges, but also to reach these heightened states of awareness.
Exactly. And going back to this idea of devotion, the podcast emphasizes the inner dimension of it over outward displays.
Right.
They're very clear about that. They say the Narad Puran prioritizes internalized devotion above complex rituals. And they even say that a single tear shed in love for the divine has more power than hundreds of yajnas done without heart.
Wow.
It's about that sincerity, the depth of feeling that matters.
So it's the intention behind the action.
Exactly.
Not just the performance of it.
It's about the bhava, the emotional state. They really stress that the bhava is more powerful than the karma itself.
Okay.
And that vibrational intensity is key.
Not just going through the motions.
No, it's about that genuine feeling, profound devotion.
And of course, the Narad Puran does outline specific practices.
It does.
So how does the podcast address that?
They acknowledge that, there are daily rituals, mantras, austerities, pilgrimage recommendations in the Puran.
Right.
But they emphasize that these are all tools.
Tools for what?
To align your pranic field with cosmic geometry.
Okay.
To create that resonance with higher energies.
And they also talk about puja.
Yes.
That daily act of worship.
Right.
So it becomes more than just offering physical things.
It's energy alchemy when done with awareness, they say.
Okay.
It's not just about the offerings, but the conscious intention, the energy you're putting into it.
Right.
Which can then transform your vasanas, your subconscious tendencies.
So it's working on those deeper levels again.
Yeah, deep work. And then there's this whole exploration of cosmology in the Narad Puran.
Right. What happens after we die?
Yeah, a huge topic.
It can be overwhelming.
It can.
So how does the podcast break that down?
Well, they touch upon the Puran's mapping of astral planes, realms of ancestors, Pechuloka, heavenly dimensions, and what happens after death.
Okay.
Like a spiritual map of that journey beyond the physical. And they also talk about rebirth and the role of devotion in that cycle.
Right.
They discuss the Prita Yoni, the spirit realm rebirth cycles, and how devotion can help you transcend the samsaric wheel, that continuous cycle of birth, death, and rebirth.
Okay.
They call it ancient psychocosmology.
That's fascinating.
Oh.
It's interesting how these ancient ideas can resonate with modern understanding.
Yes.
And the podcast actually draws connections between the principles of Bhakti and modern healing approaches.
Yes, they do.
So these practices like chanting and surrender, they're not just spiritual exercises. They can actually have real effects on our well-being.
That's what they're suggesting. They say that chanting, visualization, surrender can all reduce cortisol levels.
Okay.
Enhance oxytocin release, recalibrate the vagus nerve.
And all of this leads to
greater emotional resilience.
So it's like a bridge between these ancient practices and modern science.
A bridge between spiritual practice and our physiological and psychological states.
Okay, so finally, the podcast offers some practical suggestions for how to integrate these teachings into our lives.
They do.
What are some of those key takeaways?
Well, they say, keep your day sacred. Begin with mantra.
Okay.
Practice kindness.
Right.
Dedicate all your actions to the divine. Let bhakti become your way of life. Make your home a temple, your mind a sanctuary, your breath a prayer.
Beautiful.
Beautiful, right?
It's about weaving that devotion into every aspect of our lives.
Yeah, and their final point is so powerful. They say the Narad Puran is not mythology, it's neuro-spiritual science. It's an invitation to see these ancient texts in a whole new light.
It is, and I think Shiv and Prabha did such an incredible job with this 4-hour conversation, so hopefully this deep dive has given you a taste of what they explored.
A good starting point.
Particularly around the power of devotion. To shape our consciousness, to foster inner healing. So as you reflect on all of this, think about this. How might a small element of bhakti, as they describe it, whether it's focused attention, a moment of gratitude, a mindful practice, how might that influence your own journey of learning and understanding?
Good question.
And if you're intrigued by all this and want to learn more, we highly encourage you to go check out the original Narad Puran podcast.
Absolutely.
This is really just a starting point.
Yeah, go deeper, explore for yourself.
And see what resonates.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And we'll see you next time.
See you then.